Purim Sameach, everybody. Happy Purim. I'm going to share some stories and maybe some jokes, but first I have to tell you about this silly tallis I'm wearing. A yellow tallis? Who would wear a yellow tallis only on Purim? Well, there's a story behind it. Back in the 1980s, when they first came out with generic products, they would come in a yellow box with black lettering, and it just said what was on it. It said cereal or coffee, cornflakes. And so this is a generic tallis. And just to make sure that you know what it is, it does indeed say tallis. And if you prefer it in Hebrew, on the other side, it says talit. On the back, it says Generic Rabbi. Because everybody is always asking, what kind of rabbi are you? You wear payas, but you're not wearing a hat. You don't wear a black coat. You wear silly shirts. Of course I wear silly shirts. I'm a clown. I like to joke around. And in fact, I was ordained by Rabbi Zalman Schachter on Purim. And this was not the joke you might imagine it to be. He was acknowledging who I am. Oh, sure, I'm serious a lot of times, and I observe Orthodox, etc. But I also like to joke around. I like to have fun. And so I am the generic rabbi. Back in the 1980s, when Rabbi Moshe Adler was the rabbi at the University of Minnesota Hillel, he invited a group of Lutheran seminary students to come to Purim at Hillel. Now, these guys, they're coming to a religious service, so they come dressed real nice, expecting to sit down and hear the Megillah. They walk in, and here's all the Jews are dressed in silly costumes. They're dancing around, they're drinking, carousing, having a wonderful time. And not only that, but they're making silly noises right in the middle of a Bible reading. Oh, my goodness. Well, they were so freaked out, these Lutherans, that they ended up standing against the wall like a bunch of statues. And I think this little anecdote is a perfect illustration of the difference between the way Jews and many non-Jews view the book of Esther. I mean, for us, it's a farce, it's a satire, it's a melodrama. I mean, we drown out the name of Haman the villain, and we cheer for Mordecai. Curse Haman, bless Mordecai. Meanwhile, we lift our glasses and have a drink, and we dance and chant and sing, wear costumes, and basically it's a carnival. And it's a lot of fun. And if you read the book of Esther in that kind of an attitude, you find there's a lot of humor in it. There are some lines which, if viewed as satire, are really quite hysterical. One of the funniest lines in Esther, in the Megillah, which I laugh at every time, is when the king can't sleep. And so what do? They read him the royal chronicles. Now think about that. If someone were to read you the congressional record of the United States Senate, I'm sure you would fall asleep too. I mean, that boring old thing is going to give everybody, a cure for insomnia. Now, the reason that they have that in there is the king finds out that Mordecai saved his life, but nevertheless, it's kind of funny to think of the king. He can't sleep, and they're sitting there reading him all the boring stuff that's been going on in the court for the last 20 years. On the other hand, many non-Jews take the book of Esther extremely seriously, especially that section where the decree goes out that every man shall speak his own language in his own house, and his wife shall obey him, etc., etc., etc. Well, also at the University of Minnesota back in the 1980s, there were a number of Iranian Jews who had fled to the Twin Cities, leaving Iran when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over. And they did a Sabbath program with their own traditional foods and traditional music. The way they chant the liturgy is different from the Ashkenazi tradition most common in America, etc., etc., etc. And then there was a discussion. And one of the American women asked, well, how did you deal with wearing veils, those chador, the thing that covers your whole body? How did you deal with that? And the women replied, well, we wore it out on the street. We didn't want to be hassled, so, we put it on like everybody else. But when we came home, we tossed the thing in the corner, and we were equal to our husbands as usual. Of course, the biggest joke in the Megillah is the beauty contest. I mean, they send out through the land to find the most beautiful Persian woman who's going to become the queen, and it turns out she's Jewish. Of course, they don't know she's Jewish. I mean, Uncle Mordecai says, no, don't tell anybody you're a Jew. So she doesn't go by her Hebrew name, Hadassah, which means myrtle. I mean, myrtle is a beautiful, fragrant bush that grows throughout the Middle East. As a matter of fact, people used to carry myrtle branches in wedding processions, and my wife and I, when we were planning our wedding, read about this custom and ordered myrtle branches, and indeed, people at our wedding did carry them because we thought this would be a beautiful custom. Well, anyway, she doesn't go by Hadassah. She goes by Esther. And we don't usually translate Esther. We don't usually say, what does Esther mean? But it actually does have a meaning. Esther is a derivative of Ishtar. Ishtar was a deity, a goddess that was worshipped in ancient Persia. She was the goddess of spring and fertility. Some say also war. I suppose love and war go together sometimes, unfortunately. But anyway, Esther, who is also known as Ishtar, Astarte, Astara. Astara is the Gaelic pronunciation of her name, and she's often pictured holding a rabbit, from which the non-Jews get the Easter bunny. Because Easter, the name Easter, is also a derivative of Ishtar, Astara, the goddess of spring. She even shows up in the illustration of children's songs. So anyway, I think you get the point. Esther had a Hebrew name among her own people, and then she had this extremely goyish, non-Jewish name that enabled her to pass, and nobody knew she was a Jew until she came out and told the king. Now, people may question whether this even happened. I mean, there are some scholars that say the book of Esther is fiction, that there never was such an incident with the king. Ahasuerus is often thought to be Xerxes or Artaxerxes, but there's no real record of this kind of a thing happening. Well, leave that as it may, whatever, The fact is, a similar thing did happen in the 20th century, and it goes like this. The Nazis decided to have a contest, a baby picture contest, to find the perfect Aryan baby. And so they got together all of these baby pictures, photographers entered all these pictures, and they chose this baby. So this photo of the perfect Aryan baby was featured on all kinds of posters and all kinds of promotions. Here's a picture of it on the cover of a Nazi magazine. As it turns out, you probably guessed already, this baby was actually Jewish. And how this came about was that the photographer, without asking the parents, because I guess the copyright laws were different back then, entered the picture in the contest, and he knew they were Jewish. But he did it because he wanted to make the Nazis look ridiculous. Now, the picture is actually Hesse Taft, who said recently, she's in her 80s now, had they known about this, she wouldn't be alive today, but now you can look back and laugh at it. So it perhaps took a generation or two before we could go back and laugh at the Nazis for picking out a Jewish baby to be the perfect Aryan child. And all of this just goes to show how stupid racism is. The book of Esther is the same thing. They're going to pick out the perfect Persian, they pick out a Jew. And here they pick out the perfect Nazi and they pick out a Jew. Now, it can happen with other groups too. The fact of the matter is that we're all just one human race. And all this silliness about, race and skin tone, all that kind of stuff, we're just one human race. The Talmud says, why did God make one Adam and one Eve? And that's so nobody can say my ancestors were better than yours. To end this, I want to talk a little bit about why God is not mentioned in the Megillah. One of the interpretations is because we're going to be carousing and drinking, and we wouldn't want to desecrate the name of God by saying it in the middle of this carnival. But another teaching which I like better is that God is hidden in the world. Everything that's happening seems to just be happening as it goes along, and yet God behind the scenes has arranged things so that it will turn out as it did. And at one point, Mordecai actually says to Esther, go into the king and beg for your people. And Esther says, but the rules are I can't just walk into the court. If the king gets angry with me, he might say off with my head. And Mordecai says, who knows, perhaps it is for this very purpose to save your people that God puts you in this position to be queen. So this is something to keep in mind in our lives. Wherever we end up being, perhaps we were meant to be there because God has a plan that's bigger than ourselves. And with that, I'm going to say, Purim Sameach, happy Purim, let us all rejoice.